Galactic Coalition Threat Assessment Report. Subject: Universal Apex Organism. Origin: unknown. Threat level: Great Filter. The Universal Apex Organism, or UAO, is a hyperadaptive species capable of planetary-scale ecosystem domination and interstellar propagation. The UAO consumes all of a planet's available biomass, absorbing it into a single cohesive network. Instances of this superorganism exhibit unparalleled resilience, with rapid evolution able to neutralize in moments all known biological, chemical, and kinetic countermeasures. Following planetary sterilization, the UAO disperses fragments of itself into space, which upon planetary touchdown become new instances. Coalition records attribute the extinction of at least 56 civilizations. However, with over 400,000 recorded planets sterilized with all other traces of life eliminated, the number is likely significantly higher. Current hypotheses identify this species as the primary reason behind intelligent life's relative scarcity in the Milky Way galaxy. 100% of UAO encounters conclude with total planetary devastation. Due to its adaptability and rapid propagation, no known method of permanent neutralization exists for this organism. Coalition policy acknowledges the apex organism as an existential threat to all life in the galaxy. Directive 156.3b mandates planetary sterilization upon UAO detection, regardless of collateral damage. August 3, 2025. I would not have called it cold at the time, for only later in my existence did I first feel warmth. I would not have called it dark either, for I did not have the means to see light. Reflecting back, however, perhaps those would have been the most accurate words to describe my unwitting journey. When first my trip began, I fell into a deep sleep in hopes of preserving myself. Time, however, was not kind to me. Little by little I withered away. Without food and water to sustain my then minuscule body, death was nothing short of inevitable. Amidst my barely alive stasis, the notion of such a fate was almost comforting. I didn't remember what home was like. What little I had that could qualify as a brain carried with it no recollection of where I came from or why I left. Pieces of memory too complex to comprehend faded in and out of my consciousness during the journey. It was as though I had been reduced somehow, simplified and broken down until even my own memories were beyond grasping. After however long I floated for, eventually I awoke to the unfamiliar caress of heat against my shell, followed shortly thereafter by an inferno as I plummeted toward a fate unknown. Fire lashed against my cytoplasm as the desolate vessel upon which I traveled began to rattle apart. I felt my surface rupturing, exposing my delicate internals to the cruel outer world. Surely this was the death I had come to long for. What few cilia still wriggled about on my skin fell still, as they too accepted the end to my torment. Had my wits been about me at that juncture, perhaps I'd have regarded it as an act of cruelty from the universe that I somehow survived the impact. Starving, damaged, yet alive. Without any food, however, I could not repair myself, and so I lingered there in abject agony. I know not how long stretched the interval between my conscious moments. Not that any of it mattered, whilst I remained marooned upon my shattered vessel. After a time, the moments all bled together, each one repeating the same suffering story. My journey, thousands upon thousands of years long, would all be for naught. Then, something changed. Suddenly my environment was saturated in glorious glucose, a miracle of mercy cast upon my dying body. Slowly at first my limited faculties returned to me as I feasted upon my life-affirming biome. Steadily my surface area grew, and even as my body divided I felt my mind multiply. Together, those cells were one, and that one was I. Conquering and dividing my way through this new environment, I could hardly help but notice just how devoid the area was of other life. Surely such a bountiful place should have been flooded with other beings feeding off of it, and yet I was alone. As my pieces continued to generate more copies of themselves, so too did the thoughts bouncing between them grow more and more advanced. Why am I here? This was the first question I would ever ask myself, followed shortly thereafter by a plethora of other ponderings. Where is here? What am I? Collecting some of my scattered cells together into a central mass, I focused intently upon my environment. Previously, all I had been able to glean from this strange place was its chemical abundance of simple sugar and lack of other detectable life forms. Now, with a large enough portion of myself dedicated to the task, I began to feel something else. Vibrations in the air, pressure against my surface, sound. Something was making noise. "I've never seen anything like it," began the first source, its unintelligible yet smooth melody muffled slightly, as though there were something placed between us. That meteorite was tens of thousands of years old at least, and yet somehow these cells survived the trip here. Then came another source, this one deeper, harsher. "You've never seen anything like it because there is nothing else like it. Not on Earth, at least," it rumbled. "It shatters the record for cell replication speed at least 100 times over." I couldn't tell for sure, but something about these vibrations seemed too structured, too intentional to be mere background noise. It was like the two sources were communicating with each other. Were the progenitors of these vibrations biological? That would make sense. Perhaps, I reasoned, they were the ones who put me here in this environment. But why? And look at this collection in the center. "It's almost like they're working together," chimed the softer source, a rhythmic pattern of sounds utterly devoid of discernible meaning. "Why are we feeding it?" came a third source, softer than the harsh and somewhat squeaky. "This is an alien life form. We have no idea what it's capable of. Have none of you guys ever seen the thing?" Again, I couldn't tell what they were trying to communicate. Repeated yet random patterns of sound between the entities practically confirmed that this was some kind of sound-based communication. I longed to know what these creatures were saying. "Are they perhaps discussing what to do with me?" I wondered. Again, the softer voice rang out. "It isn't a movie monster, Jason," it hissed, the sounds it produced sharper than before. "It's the most important scientific discovery since, perhaps the most important one in all of human history," interrupted the deepest voice. It sounded less harsh than before, settling into a monotone hum. By this point, the glucose in my environment had been entirely absorbed into me, and yet still I hungered, not just for nourishment, but also for more knowledge on my environment. Unfortunately for me, the next several hours would provide me with neither. Continuous chatter emanated from outside the confines of my habitat, with at least a dozen different sources all sounding out around me. At no point during that period was I left unattended. Naturally, when one of the voices did decide to do something, that thing was to hurt me. With little prelude save for a small squeeze near one of my thinner tendrils, it was sliced off by something sharp. "It's eating me," I thought, reflexively attempting to retreat from my aggressor, only to hit a wall both figurative and literal as my biomass flopped helplessly against the glass surface of my prison. I was so afraid, lying in wait for the creature to finish me off, to once again bite into me or perhaps to swallow me whole. I was too small, too weak to fight back. All I could do at the time was to wait for my inevitable death at the claws of a superior life form. "Holy shit," one of the sources murmured quietly. Again, I felt the pressure on one of my tendrils, and anticipating another bite, I repositioned myself to a different corner of the enclosure. "Are you guys seeing this?" "I think you heard it when you collected that sample," the soft source responded. "We have no clue what kind of defenses it might have, so maybe we shouldn't do that again until we know more." I had no idea what the smaller source has told its packmates, but whatever it said must have been in my favor, as immediately the attack upon me ceased. The sources, meanwhile, would continue non-stop for far longer. As time wore on, several of my observers came and went, totaling to perhaps a dozen. On all sides they surrounded me, their correspondences coinciding with each and every move I made. It was like they were studying me, sizing me up with intentions unknown. Oddly enough, though it had been severed from my body, I could still vaguely feel that piece of me cut away by the sources calling out. Initially, I had assumed they were just going to eat it, but the fact that it was still thinking after this long suggested some kind of alternative intention. "Look at this," the soft source whispered, practically inaudible from where my main body sat but close enough to the severed piece that I could still pick up its vibrations by proxy. "These cells are communicating with each other. It's like some kind of neural network." Immediately, every source in the room, including the ones surrounding me, ceased their activities to go and join the soft one by my lost tendril. "Look at those flagella!" The squeaky source boomed loud enough for my main body to receive. "That structure, like a nine-tailed whip, it's sending signals to the others." It's thinking!" Concentrating on the phantom signals sent by my carved-out tendril, I listened intently to the melodic tongue of these strange creatures as they discussed amongst themselves something to which I was not privy. "It seems to function like some form of neural network," hummed a source that I would later recount as nasally. "How advanced of a network are we talking?" said the squeaky one, their voice tinged with something I did not recognize. Hard to say, replied the deep one, its voice coinciding with a light poke to my severed tendril. These cells aren't like the ones we see on Earth. They're not differentiating. In essence, every piece of this organism is a brain, a muscle, and a nerve. This is astounding. I have an idea, said the soft one, its voice slowly moving away from my severed tendril and instead approaching the barrier which kept me contained. Professor Morick, I'd like permission to add another 5 grams of glucose to the environment. Following a long, droning hum, the deeper voice replied, What sort of result are you anticipating? I'm not quite sure yet, answered the soft voice. But so far the organism's behaviors have been relatively simple, eating, growing, and avoiding danger. I'm curious as to what it might do with more neurons. Suddenly, the correspondence between these two sources grew to include all 12 or so. Judging by how their tones varied, I suspected this to be some form of disagreement, though without a working knowledge of their language, I could not determine its topic. Eventually, however, the other sources quieted down as the deep one once again spoke out. Apologies, Jason, but the overwhelming consensus appears to agree with Miss Stern. Jane, you are permitted to administer the glucose solution. Miscellaneous clinking sounds resounded beside my container as just on the barrier's other side, I heard the soft one's voice. Administering glucose now? Once again, my environment was saturated in simple sugar, which I quickly took to devouring. This time, my environment was rendered barren within mere seconds, as I consumed every last available drop. With my hunger for nourishment temporarily sated, I turned my attention towards the lingering desire for information. There was only so much I could determine from vibrations in the air. A new avenue of perception was required. Feeling the vague heat of variable radiation upon my surface, an idea struck me. By contrasting the light hitting my surface against the darkness within, I organized a few of my more radiation-receptive cells into a flat surface. I was able to make out a small range of wavelengths. Forming a pit from this surface, I was able to determine the direction of this light. Finally, covering up the small pit save for a hole on the surface, I was able to somewhat perceive my surroundings. The creatures which surrounded me were strange. Bright white central masses connected 2 tendril pairs with bulbous growths between the upper ones. Watching them move around was uncanny. Their tendrils didn't look like mine. Rigid lengths of flesh connected by hinges gave them a simultaneous stiffness and flexibility. With the lower limbs, they traversed about the room around us, separated from me by a near-invisible barrier. With the upper ones, they wielded a variety of tools, and the purpose of which I could not comprehend. Just on the other side of the barrier, I saw that one of these entities had lowered themselves so that their top bulb was directly lined up with my cage. For a moment I recoiled from it in fright, and yet when I heard its voice, I recognized it as the soft one. "Hi there," it said, fiddling with some kind of device beside my prison to release from it one last tiny drop of glucose. Putting together the evidence provided, I deduced that it had been the soft one who fed me the second time, and likely the first as well. Plastered up against the other side of my translucent cell, I saw the end of the soft one's upper tendril. 5 smaller digits extended out from a flat lump at the limb's end. Slithering up against the invisible wall, I extended myself against it in the shape of their appendage. I'm not sure why, but in that moment I felt a strange kinship with this being. Gasps resounded around my container as the other creatures witnessed this display. Perhaps they were surprised, or maybe even afraid. I wasn't quite sure. "What do we call it?" said the soft one, looking to its packmates as though expecting them to reply. "Omnicellular replicans," murmured the deep one, kneeling down beside us for a closer look at me. "Okay, but what about a name?" asked the soft one, slowly retracting their hand from the glass until only a single digit remained pressed there. "You know, something casual." Again, the figures around me began to discuss amongst themselves. As per usual, I hadn't a clue what they were debating. Only that given the length of deliberation, it seemed rather important. All the while, as they spoke, I continued attempting to perfect my visual receptor, hoping to obtain a clearer image of my surroundings and of the soft one. I must have tried 100 permutations during their argument. "We should probably name it after something from mythology," the nasally one added. Apparently its idea was popular amongst the others, as multiple times I heard the word mythology repeated, along with a few other phrases like Prometheus's and Atlas. "Jason," began the deep one, gesturing towards one of the creatures standing near the soft one. "You've taken a few mythology classes. Have any ideas?" For a moment, the one they spoke to fell silent as though in contemplation. Then, he moved his digits in such a way as to create a sharp snapping sound, quickly gathering the other's attention. "How about Samael?" "Who's that?" asked the soft one, turning the features of their upper bulb towards the one who snapped. "An angel from Hebrew mythology," replied the squeaky one, again referencing that repeatedly spoken phrase. "He's sometimes associated with light and knowledge." Following another few seconds of deliberation, the others nodded their heads in what seemed to be a gesture of agreement as again the soft one turned to face me. As fate would have it, my newly adapted optical lens came into focus just as she spoke, allowing me to at last view her face. Two orbs of pure blackness surrounded by rings of blue focused upon me intently, as beneath them a pair of pinkish skin flaps separated and came back together in sound-producing patterns. "Hello, Samael." Immediately the others chimed in with various phrases of their own, repeating that last one seemingly in reference to me. Perhaps they assigned titles to each other based on noises. If that were the case, then it would appear they had given one to me. I am Samael. August 9th, 2025. Activity surrounded my container non-stop as the creatures continued their work in analyzing me, altering my environment in subtle ways and observing how I reacted before marking down the results on flat white sheets. All the while as they studied me, I was doing the same with regards to them, trying to learn as much as I could about these enigmatic entities. I did not know at the time what day and night were, only that the researchers seemed to come and go based upon some kind of periodic schedule. Each time a group entered, they held their appendages beneath the steel neck of a strange device and turned some kind of mechanism to make it spew a liquid I presumed to be water. Bizarre as this grooming ritual first appeared to me, it was at the very least helpful in keeping time, as while inactive the device continued to spew droplets at regular intervals. Every 50 drips or so, a new group would arrive, and 20 drips after that, the previous one would leave. This cycle continued through 6 groups before looping back around to the first. At no point during this repeating sequence was I left unattended. By far, my favorite part of this cycle was when the second set of researchers arrived. This was the soft ones group, a fact that alone made it the best one. I held no particular dislike for the other researchers, but the soft one was special. The soft one spoke to me far more often than the others did, and its voice was warmer and gentler as though afraid it might frighten me. Frequently, I found myself leaning toward whatever side of the container she happened to be on without fully understanding why. Though I treasured my interactions with the soft one above all others, that wasn't to say I found no intellectual value in the rest. Indeed, each and every individual had something to teach me. I noticed, for example, how most of these creatures had flat upper torsos and more pronounced musculature. Others, like the soft one, bore slight protrusions on the chest and seemed generally smaller. My initial hypothesis was that they were part of different subspecies, but seeing how the nasally one in the third group seemed to give preferential treatment to those of the other morph, rather than its own, I would ultimately wind up discarding this theory. This cycle began as every other one did when the first group, consisting of the squeaky one, the deep one, and 3 others, entered the lab. After helping the 6th group finish their experiments and seeing them off, this set of researchers began their own investigation, primarily focusing on my severed tendril now contained within a thin glass dish. "What is this genetic structure?" asked the squeaky one, peering into some kind of exceptionally bulky device with a confused expression on their face. "It's not DNA or RNA. Of course it isn't," replied the deep one, stepping over to the bulky device and gently nudging their compatriot aside before peering in themselves. "Expecting an alien organism to have DNA exactly the same as our own is like expecting it to speak French." For the next 3 drips, each member of the second group took turns peering into this strange device. Clearly, whatever they were seeing behind the perfectly spaced pair of lenses was deeply fascinating to them. "That base sugar," began the group's tallest creature. "It looks like... is that glucose?" "Not possible," replied the squeaky one, all but shoving the tall one out of the way for another look through the lenses. "Glucose has too many hydroxyl groups. It's not stable enough to reliably store information." Apparently something this individual had said was interesting to the deep one as immediately they interjected. "Normally you would be correct, Jason." It hummed, stroking the thin veil of fur beneath its lower lip. "Glucose is too reactive for a stable genetic backbone. At least on Earth it is. This organism's biochemistry clearly evolved under different circumstances than our own." "I guess that'd explain how it replicates so fast," responded the squeaky one, emitting a steady, deflated hiss of air from its speech orifice. Again, I hadn't a clue what they were saying, but judging by the glances they kept tossing towards me, I guessed that it must have been something involving my tendril. As the first group's investigation of me continued into the 45th drip, I began to grow restless. At the 50th drip, the soft one would arrive. She always arrived around that time. Evidently, the researchers of this group had taken notice of my fidgeting, with 3 of them abandoning their lens device to instead peer curiously into my cage. "It doesn't usually ripple like that, right?" began the tall one, glancing at the others expectantly with his finger pressed up against the glass and angled in my direction. "Not that I've seen," replied the roundest of these creatures, quickly snatching up a white sheet and making marks on it with one of their strange, tiny sticks. "Do you think it wants something?" Intrigued for whatever reason by my movements, the deep one and squeaky one quickly joined in on the group's collective observation. "That can't be good," murmured the squeaky one, their eyes refusing to close as they observed my movements with the careful precision of a predator waiting to pounce. Anxiously pressing myself against the wall across from the squeaky one, I fell still in hopes that they in particular would lose interest. I felt no ill will towards this creature, but I certainly did not like how they were looking at me. "I think you might have scared it, Jason," remarked the tallest, moving aside to make way for the squeaky one, who promptly stepped closer and leaned down to face me. Looking directly upon me, the squeaky one's eyes initially retained their glassy coldness. Their hostile expression, however, would soon soften into mere indifference as I flinched in response to them tapping the glass. "How large do you guys think these things can get?" it said to the others, prompting a momentary pause as they all seemed to be considering those words. Before the group could reach consensus, however, the laboratory door opened and the soft one stepped in. Immediately upon seeing her, I navigated to the other side of my cage and pressed myself against its invisible wall, no longer afraid, but rather overwhelmed by the desire to be close to her. "Did I miss anything big?" the soft one said to the others, reaching into the bag formerly mounted on her back and producing it a smaller, clear bag of tiny, flesh-colored lumps. "Well, those are new. I had never seen her bring whatever these pink things were into the lab before, so naturally I was curious. Fortunately for me, it was the squeaky one that stepped away from my container to welcome the second group, whose remaining members filed into the lab behind the soft one. "Well, its genetic material is glucose-based, so that sort of explains how it's growing so quickly," it told them, gesturing toward my cage as the second group ran their hands beneath the faucet before joining the others in their activity. "What the hell are those?" it continued, jabbing one of its fingers toward the bag of lumps. "They're pinkies," replied the soft one, holding up the container for the squeaky one to get a closer look. "Neonatal mice that are usually fed to reptiles. My sister owns a ball python, so she let me borrow some." At first, the squeaky one looked puzzled by whatever she had said, but after a few seconds of awkward silence, his eyes went wide. "Don't tell you're going to feed those to it." "Morik told me it'd make for an interesting experiment," continued the soft one, her lips curved upward in what I recognized as a sign of contentment. I liked it when her lips curved up. "Samael is too large now to subsist on pure glucose, so we have to figure out what it actually eats." "Don't tell me you actually approve this, Doc," the squeaky one half shouted, looking to the deep one as though searching for a particular response. The deep one didn't even glance back at them as it instead approached my cage. I did. "This experiment is necessary if we are to understand our guest here," it began, gesturing for the soft one to join him in front of my container's translucent wall. "Do you have any genuine objections, Jason, or are you just afraid we might give the big bad alien a taste for flesh?" "That is a legitimate concern," replied the squeaky one, crossing its upper limbs over its torso and regarding the deep one with a displeased expression. Soon enough, however, whatever point of contention existed between the researchers seemed to fade away as they all surrounded my cage and made room for the soft one. Excitement pulsed within my body as the soft one approached. She always made sure to feed me at the beginning of her group's turn, and so as she approached, I presumed this time would be the same. However, rather than reaching for the glucose dispenser like she usually did, the soft one instead reached into the clear bag and picked up one of the pink lumps. "Okay, Samael," she whispered, instantly soothing any concerns I may have had in that moment. "Let's see if you like this," she continued, opening the latch to my cage and dropping in the pink lump. At first, I wasn't sure what to think about this strange object. It didn't seem overtly dangerous, but nevertheless, I exercised caution in my approach. Keeping to the sides of my tank, I undulated around the pink mass, attempting to take in as much information about it as I could without getting too close. Much like the researchers around me, it had two sets of tendrils, albeit of a different structure than theirs. Its face was longer relative to the body, but with many features analogous to those of the soft one's kind. Elongating one of my tendrils and reaching out toward this creature, I poked and prodded at it curiously, expecting some form of reaction. When my efforts were met with nary a flinch, I slithered closer to the pink creature in hopes to investigate it further. It was cold to the touch, and its chest wasn't rising and falling like those of the researchers did constantly. Poking it a few more times just to be safe, I eventually concluded that it was, in fact, no longer alive. Outside my cage, the deep one and those around it furiously took notes on my behavior. The soft one, meanwhile, simply watched. I didn't want to do the wrong thing. That, I reasoned, might disappoint the soft one. And so, with no knowledge of what was desired of me, I stared indecisively at the dead creature. "Doesn't look like it's biting," began the squeaky one, their cold expression melting into something I would later come to understand as relief. "Maybe Samael doesn't understand that it's meant to be food," hummed the soft one in reply. Leaning down to face me more directly, she pressed her hand against the glass. Seeing this, I quickly abandoned the pink lump to press up against the soft one's palm. Once she had my attention, however, the soft one removed her hand and with one finger gestured toward the pink mass. Then, with that same finger, she pointed toward the glucose dispensing device. Apparently, something about this act served as a source of mirth for the others, a few of whom began to chuckle at the soft one. "It's not a dog, Jane," began the squeaky one, its lips curling upward in derogatory amusement. "It can't understand you." Shifting my gaze between the dispenser and the mass, eventually it clicked what the soft one was trying to communicate. Navigating back toward the pink mass, I carefully wrapped my tendrils around it and began pulling it into myself. Gasps sounded out from the other researchers as I absorbed the lump and began to digest it within myself, savoring the sheer nutrient density of the meal. Compared to this feast, the glucose was paltry. Not a single drip passed between my engulfing the meal and its complete integration into my own biomass. Once I had finished absorbing the pink lump, I quickly returned to the soft one's side of the tank and pressed myself against it in a gesture of gratitude. "Did anyone record how fast that was?" asked the round one, their eyes wide with disbelief. 1 minute and 13 seconds, replied the deep one, their gaze shifting between myself and the soft one. "It digested that whole mouse in 73 seconds. "That is horrifying," interjected the squeaky one, their gaze once again assuming a predatory coldness as they looked upon me. However, now that the soft one was with me, I no longer felt afraid. "No," the deep one continued. "Astounding!" Uproarious chatter erupted between the researchers as they discussed the results of my feeding amongst themselves. "Jane, did it just understand you?" said the tall one, emphatically pointing towards me. I think it did," replied the soft one, refusing to take her eyes off of me as I followed her hand's path across the glass. "Professor, I'd like permission to try and hand-feed Samael." For a moment, the deep one seemed to contemplate whatever she had said. Eventually, however, he looked toward her and nodded, a gesture that I knew conveyed agreement. "I'll allow it." "Are you people fucking insane?" shouted the squeaky one, his hands intermingling with the fur on top of his head. "We just watched that thing digest snake food in less than 2 minutes, and you're going to put your hand in there with it? And Professor, you're allowing this?" "Under normal circumstances, I would agree with you, Jason," the deep one answered, watching with a curious glint in its eye as the soft one retrieved another pink lump from the bag. "That being said, I'm also terribly curious." Just as she did before, the soft one carefully unlatched my cage. This time, however, instead of simply dropping in the food, she held it out to me within the palm of her hand. Tentatively, I crawled close to her appendage, my tendrils lingering on the warmth of her fingers now separated only by thin blue gloves. Reaching out gently to the pink mass in her hand, I carefully wrapped my tendrils around it and began retreating to the far end of my cage to eat without risk of harming the soft one. Once again, the lab fell silent with awe.